Reich Marshal Hermann Goering, an unpopular World War I fighter pilot who had become one of Hitler's earliest lackeys, commanded the Luftwaffe with a capriciousness that drove his operational-level officers to utter, helpless frustration.
Goering was a fighter pilot in World War I who was highly decorated. He received the Pour le Mérite for shooting down over 20 enemy aircraft. He ended up with 22. But the interesting thing about his World War I career was that when he took over the Richthofengeschwader a few months after Richthofen had died in action, he really proved that he was not anywhere near the kind of leader that Richthofen was. The guys in JG-1 hated him, and in fact, after the war, they didn't invite him to their reunions because they hated him so much. He was a martinet. He only flew a couple of combat missions and then basically grounded himself so he could pay attention to his administrative duties. So he very rarely flew combat with them. So he was kind of a bloated Prussian egomaniac, even back then. And it only got worse. After the beer hall putsch in 23, he was wounded and he became a morphine addict, and that was an addiction he struggled with through most of his life after that. And he became more and more obnoxious and arrogant and covetous of medals and awards and promotions and titles and recognition. And the pilots in the German Air Force actually referred to him as Fat Herman. They did not particularly like him, especially after the events of the Battle of Britain, where he started accusing his fighter pilots of all kinds of misdeeds. They really became hostile towards him. And even today, they talk about Goering, and they're very, very, very hostile. He was a despicable human being.
Hermann Goering, before the war, was tops, as long as there was no war. In the war, what happened when you were a squadron commander, and every evening you reported how many airplanes you have for the next day. Say you had 16 airplanes, but you had only 10 ready for the next day because those were shot up and had to be repaired. You cannot only report 10 airplanes, no. But they did. They changed it, till it came up to the top. They had more planes as we had, twice as many airplanes as we had flying. That was one thing. And Goering was not a leader.
In the 1930s, Goering's vision of the Luftwaffe had been simplistic and dangerously unrealistic. Basically, he wanted airplanes and lots of them. When proponents of long-range strategic bombing tried to convince the Reichsmarschall to order the production of 4-engine bombers that could carry out the task, Goering refused. 4-engine bombers would take up too much material, he argued, so fewer planes would be produced. He wanted numbers, not strategic bombers, and he could have twice as many twin-engine planes as 4-engine ones for the same cost. The decision would have serious consequences later when his twin-engine Terror bombers were forced into the role of strategic bombers in 1940 and 41. In the summer of 1940, these shortcomings became obvious for the first time. After the fall of France in June, Hitler flung the Luftwaffe against England in preparation for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of the Home Isles. That summer and fall, the Luftwaffe was charged with destroying the Royal Air Force in battle. Poor staff planning, a dispersion of effort, and political interference with the selection of targets doomed the Luftwaffe's campaign. Worst of all, the pilots and crews were being asked to fight a strategic air war with an air force designed for tactical ground support and terror bombing. The result was the loss of almost 2,000 aircraft for no gain whatsoever. By the early fall of 1940, Hitler had suspended Operation Sea Lion and turned his attention to Russia. When Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, began in June of 1941, the Luftwaffe at first glance seemed to be well suited to this new campaign. was a war of tactical ground support on a grand scale, and in the early weeks of the war, the Luftwaffe cleaned house. Some 15,000 Soviet planes were destroyed, as were thousands of tanks, trucks, airfields, bridges, railheads, and other targets just behind the front lines. Yet operations were costly, and by the end of 1941, the Luftwaffe was stretched ever thinner as it sought to support the Wehrmacht through the dead of winter.
In the period 1941 through early 1943, as the Luftwaffe becomes committed to a global war, they'll find their assets stretched to the limit. And they'll also begin to feel the effects of the attrition that they are beginning to suffer, starting with the Battle of Britain, the meat grinder that the Eastern Front will become, and in actions in the Mediterranean as they're sent down to stop the convoys coming to Malta, fight in the desert, and then try to evacuate the forces from North Africa. They'll suffer some horrendous losses, especially in their bomber and transport crews. And what the effect of these losses is that many of their most experienced pilots, those that would be part of their training base, have been lost. And so the Germans will have a problem with training replacement pilots. By the end of the war, there'll be plenty of planes to fly, but there'll not be any German pilots to fill the cockpits.
Though the skilled German pilots took a heavy toll of Allied ships and planes, their own numbers were whittled down through simple attrition.
On Palm Sunday in 1943, I never forget that, we were escorting 50 Junkers 52, and over there it looked like a swarm of bees waiting for us. We all were shot down. And I made it about 5 kilometers before the beach in Sicily. Then I had to ditch. We lost all the airplanes.
By the summer of 1942, the Luftwaffe was hemorrhaging on 2 fronts, and replacements weren't keeping pace with the losses.
We never saw anything in the papers about our planes being shut down. And if there were, the number was always so minimal as we were just winning. There was nothing else but winning.
And then a new and far more deadly threat arrived, one that would ultimately doom the Luftwaffe, the United States Army Air Force. That summer, the Americans undertook their first attempts at daylight strategic bombing. The Halpro mission in North Africa kicked the campaign off with an ineffective raid against Ploesti in June. On July 4th, American-flown bombers struck France for the first time. A month later, the legendary 8th Air Force flew its first mission against Rouen, France. These were hardly even pinpricks against the might of the Third Reich, but they were harbingers of the future. One man saw it coming and urged Hermann Goering to take action. General Adolf Galland, one of the Luftwaffe's greatest fighter pilots and leaders, viewed these first raids with alarm. The Reich's own home air defenses were woefully lacking. Most of the combat units were fighting at the front. And since the British were bombing Germany under the cover of darkness, most of Germany's defenses were geared to stopping nocturnal raids. The Americans were coming over in broad daylight, and that would require new fighters and new tactics to stop. Galland